This is the AP exam review videos. We're going to start with, in our first video, we're going to go over and review Units 1 and 2. We'll do 2 chapters in this session because Unit 1 is so much shorter and a smaller percentage of the AP exam. And then we'll do Unit 2 also, which is a little bit more significant in the number of terms and topics that you would need to know for the AP exam. So let's jump right into Unit 1. And review this fairly quickly. Unit 1 is basically focused around topics that are thematic, we'll say. They are the central themes behind psychology, and it's kind of an intro into the psychological fields. They're kind of divided. Unit 1 is kind of in 3 categories. You have the people, which were early philosophers or psychologists. Another category would be the topics that psychologists study, and then a third topic would be the fields or the sub-disciplines inside of psychology itself. So as far as the questions that psychologists research, the major question, of course, is nature versus nurture. You're going to get into whether or not something is inborn or genetic, part of someone's biology, or inherited as a trait, or you get into the nurture side of things, which is to suggest that something is environmental, cultural, part of their being raised, if you will, something that's nurtured into them, whether it's a social interaction or something they learned in school or something they gained from their culture or parenting, but not genetic, not heritable, and not inborn. The second of the 3 kind of categories from Unit 1 is the perspectives themselves, the various subfields in psychology. There's really 7 subfields in psychology, and we have them on a spectrum here from the most natural, being the most genetically inborn, all the way to nurture, and everywhere in between. So if you look at the categories, you have biology, evolutionary psychology, cognitive psychology, humanistic psychology, psychodynamics, behavioral psychology, or behaviorism as it's often referred to, and you have social, cultural, or social psychology. So the first one is biological. That has to do with, these are kind of the buzzwords that you see in AP exam questions. Biology are the biological sciences or anything that refer to genes, the brain or nervous system, neurotransmitters, blood chemistry, anything having to do with the genetic biological makeup of a human or an animal. That's going to be something that you recognize as being biological. It's part of the autonomic or somatic nervous system. Evolutionary psychology is specifically centered around Darwin's idea of natural selection, the idea that a trait is biological. It could potentially be learned, but in any event, the reason why an animal or a person especially would possess a certain trait would have explanation in natural selection, meaning that the 2 buzz phrases that you would need to know for evolutionary psychology would be: it helped us to survive as a species and to reproduce as a species. So those are kind of the 2 buzzwords with evolutionary psychology. Any question that's going to be asked about that, those are the phrases that you'll need to recognize. It allowed a species to survive and adapt in their environment long enough to find a mate and to reproduce, and thus the species continued on. Cognitive psychology we'll get into in much more detail in another chapter, another review video. But cognition is referred to, it's not really the biology of the mind, it's not really the neurotransmitters of the brain, so to speak. It's more the studying of the thought processes themselves. So anything that has to do with a cognitive process does not biologically explain. So fears, hopes, thoughts, memories, communication of any kind really, but mainly verbal communication, dreams, anything that's thought process or thought related is referred to as cognition. Humanistic psychology is known as self-help psychology or positive psychology. Those are people like Abraham Maslow, Martin Seligman, the people who study self-actualization and how a functional person reaches their full potential of what's known as self-actualization, reaching one's potential as a person. So this would be self-help or positive psychology. Psychodynamics refer to the work of people like Sigmund Freud and the Neo-Freudians, and that's studying the dynamics of the mind, the psyche, as it's known. and that's this unconscious drives and motives that drive behavior. And again, that's going to be Sigmund Freud or any of the neo-Freudians or psychodynamic. Often you'll also see that interchangeable with psychoanalytic or psychoanalysis. Behaviorism or behavioral psychology refers to the idea that behaviors are motivated from learned experiences from the past. So if we have a trait as a human, it's because we have learned that trait either through pain or a reward, right? And that's kind of broken down into multiple ways to learn. You have classical conditioning, and those are just associated responses. At the most basic level, accidental association of two unrelated things. But you also have operant conditioning. Operant conditioning we'll get into in a lot more detail in another chapter also. But a preview for that would be any behavior that is motivated by the outcome from which it carries, whether that's a punishment or a reward. So behaviorism is going to be observable responses that are the result of learned outcomes or consequences. So we'll get into more behaviorism in Unit 2 and even beyond that in Unit 6 when we get into learning. And finally, we have social psychology or social cultural psychology, and that's any social or environmental situation that impacts a human, a person, whether it's how they're raised or whether it's their culture, whether it's their racial details that make them who they are, or school interactions, whatever the case may be. These are all the most nurture you can have. These are all the traits that are things that are not genetically inborn. So getting into some of the other just kind of minor topics from Unit 1, one that I think stands out to me is the idea of SQ3R. It's a study method for reading and retaining information, especially in nonfiction texts like a textbook. The suggested method is SQ3R, which is an acronym. The S is for survey, the Q is for question, and the 3 R's are read, rehearse, and review. So read only as long as you can absorb information, which most psychologists believe is about 15 to 20 minutes before you're no longer benefiting from reading anymore. Rehearsing that information, which is part of the memory retention process, and reviewing it, going over notes, note cards, study guides, etc. So a couple of names. This is the third and final component of Unit 1 are the people. The first and earliest are the philosophers. So psychology kind of has its roots in a combination of philosophy and biology, and obviously as medical and biological technologies have improved, there's less philosophy in psychology, theory if you will, and there's more biological understanding. But there are also things about the brain that we don't understand. They're still pretty much philosophical. So that's why you might wonder, why are there ancient philosophers? Why are there Greek philosophers? Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. They were not psychologists, nor would they have considered themselves psychologists or even known what the term psychologist meant. But why they appear in the curriculum is because psychology has its roots in philosophy and in biology. So the philosophers that are fair game that you may be asked about, the 3 Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And then you have enlightened thinkers like John Locke, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes. You can look at the PowerPoint slide, or PowerPoint presentation, that has all of the names of famous people that are noteworthy for the AP exam. That's another link that you have access to. But going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, they all had similar viewpoints about various things. They came from the same school of thought, and then literally the same school. But there is a difference that you would know between the 3. Aristotle of the 3 is the nurture philosopher. He is the one that believed that human beings were the result of their experiences, that we were not brought into this world with much in terms of personality traits, likes or dislikes, that we are the result of our experiences. What's known as empiricism, results from our experiences. They shape who we are and how we turn out. So Aristotle is easy to confuse with Plato and Socrates, but you need to separate them. It might be easier to know that Aristotle is going to be more like John Locke in his philosophy. Wilhelm Wundt, the German name, obviously this is the University of Leipzig professor in Germany who is credited with becoming the first modern psychologist. The reason for that is because he's the first to create a psychological lab for experimental purposes. So he designed and developed experiments of the mind, and he created the first research lab. And so Wundt is considered kind of the father of modern psychology for his work in sensory interaction lab studies that he did at the University of Leipzig. John Locke is probably the most significant name of all of the Enlightened era thinkers because he came up with the idea of tabula rasa, which is the Latin phrase for blank slate, that the mind is not predetermined, that we make free will choices, and that we come into this world as a blank slate, metaphorically speaking, of course, and we become the result of our experiences. So John Locke and Aristotle are very similar in that way in their philosophy.